The heavy glass door of the Lucky Crane diner closed with a soft thud, cutting off the cold wind and the city's constant noise. Kang Min-Lee stood for a second, letting the smell of toasted sesame oil and spicy cabbage wash over him. In the outside world, his name was a whisper that made grown men tremble. He was a man of expensive suits, dark cars, and even darker orders. But inside these four walls, under the warm, yellow glow of the neon lights, he was just a man who liked his soup extra hot. Mr. Han Suwoo was already behind the counter. His back was slightly bent from years of standing over a stove, and his face was a map of deep lines and kind smiles. When he saw Min-Lee, he didn't bow in fear like the men who worked for the syndicate. He simply wiped his hands on a stained white apron and nodded. He knew Min-Lee was the king of the streets, but he also remembered the skinny boy who used to hide in his kitchen to escape the rain. Min-Lee walked to his usual booth in the far corner. The vinyl seat was cracked, and the table had a slight wobble, but it felt better than any velvet chair in a penthouse office. Here, he didn't have to look over his shoulder. He didn't have to worry about who was trying to steal his power. Mr. Han brought over a small bowl of kimchi and a cup of steaming barley tea without being asked. He knew Min-Lee's favorites as well as his own. "You look tired, Michael, Mr. Han said softly, using the English name Min-Lee had used when he first arrived in this country. Min-Lee looked up, his sharp eyes softening just a little. "It has been a long week. Old friend, the city is getting louder." Mr. Han chuckled, the sound like dry leaves rustling. "The city is always loud. You just need to remember how to listen to the quiet." He patted Min-Lee's shoulder, a gesture that would have cost anyone else their life, and went back to the kitchen. Min-Lee watched the old man work. Their bond was built on years of shared silence and the memory of Min-Lee's mother. When she was struggling to find her footing in a land that didn't want her, Mr. Han had been the one to give her extra food for her son. He had seen their pain before Min-Lee had learned to hide it behind a wall of ice. In this diner, Min-Lee could feel the parts of himself he thought he had buried. He remembered the feeling of being a son, not a boss. He remembered the taste of home before he had traded his heart for a crown of thorns. The diner was a sanctuary, a small island of peace in a sea of violence. It was the only place where he didn't feel like a monster. As he took a sip of the warm tea, he felt his muscles finally start to relax. For a moment, the crown was gone, and he was just a man waiting for a bowl of soup. He didn't know that tonight. The peace he loved so much was about to be broken. The peaceful hum of the diner was broken by the harsh sound of the front door slamming against the wall. The bell above the door didn't just jingle, it rattled like a warning. 3 men walked in, bringing the cold air and a sense of trouble with them. They didn't walk like people who were hungry for food. They walked like people who were hungry for a fight. Leading the group was Rico Spades. He was thin and wiry, wearing a flashy jacket that looked too expensive for a man who didn't seem to have a real job. He had a mean look in his eyes, the kind that comes from picking on people who can't fight back. Walking right behind him was Marcus Tank Doyle. Tank was a giant of a man, with shoulders so broad he had to turn slightly to fit through the doorway. He had a thick neck and heavy boots that made the floorboards groan with every step. To a man like Kang Min-Lee, these were not rivals. In the world of the Mafia, Rico and his crew were nothing more than low-level trash. They were the kind of small-time bullies that Min-Lee's organization usually ignored, the same way a lion ignores a fly. They dealt in cheap drugs in street corners, far below the tall glass buildings where Min-Lee made his deals. But in this quiet, clean diner, their presence felt like a dark stain on a white sheet. Rico didn't look for a seat. Instead, he stood in the middle of the room and looked around with a sneer. He kicked a chair out of his way, making a loud scraping noise that made Mr. Han flinch behind the counter. Rico's eyes landed on Ugochi, who was standing near the kitchen door with a tray of clean glasses. She froze, her fingers tightening on the metal edges of the tray. "Hey, sweetheart," Rico called out, his voice loud and grating in the small space. "Is this how you treat customers? We've been here for 10 seconds, and I don't have a menu in my hand yet." Tank laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that felt like a threat. He pulled out a chair at a table near the center and sat down heavily, leaning back until the wood creaked. The third man leaned against the door, crossing his arms and blocking the exit. The air in the diner, which had felt like home just moments ago, now felt thick and hard to breathe. Min-Lee didn't move. He sat in his dark corner, his face hidden by the shadows. He watched the way Rico looked at Ugochi, with a cruel kind of hunger that had nothing to do with a meal. He watched the way Tank tapped his thick fingers on the table, impatient to cause damage. Min-Lee's soup was still steaming in front of him, but his appetite was gone. He felt a familiar coldness rising in his chest. It was the part of him that knew exactly how to deal with disorder. These men thought they were the kings of the room because they were loud and big. They didn't realize that the real power in the city was sitting only a few feet away, watching them with eyes that saw everything. The sanctuary had been violated, and the silence of the dragon was starting to feel like the silence before a storm. Ugochi's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her eyes lowered, focusing on the silver tray in her hands. To Rico and Tank, she was just a girl in a blue uniform, someone they could scare for fun. They didn't see the woman who stayed up until 3 a.m. studying biology textbooks by the light of a single lamp. They didn't see the daughter who sent more than half of her paycheck back to a small village in Nigeria every single month. As she walked toward their table, her mind tried to drift away to a safer place. She thought about her mother's voice over the phone, crackling with distance but full of pride. She thought about her younger brother, whose school fees were paid because Ugochi worked double shifts and never bought herself new clothes. She was in this country to become a doctor. She wanted to be the person who saved lives, not the person who lived in fear of men with loud voices and cruel hearts. "I asked for a menu, sweetheart. Are you deaf as well as slow?" Rico's voice snapped her back to the reality of the diner. "I am sorry, sir," Ugochi said. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook just enough to make the glasses on her tray clink together. "Here are your menus." She set them down carefully, trying not to get too close to Rico's reaching hands. She could feel the weight of her family on her shoulders. If she lost this job, her brother couldn't go to school. If she got hurt, her mother would have no one to help with the bills. She had to be invisible. She had to be strong. She had to endure the insults because her dreams were bigger than their hate. Tank reached out and tapped the biology book sitting on the edge of the counter. "What's this? You think you're going to be a scientist or something?" He laughed, and the sound made Ugochi feel small. "You should stick to pouring coffee. It's all you're good for." Ugochi didn't answer. She knew that any word she said would only give them a reason to get louder. She looked toward the back of the diner, hoping Mr. Han would come out from the kitchen, but she also hoped he stayed away. He was old, and these men looked like they enjoyed breaking things. Then, her eyes flickered to the dark corner where the man in the expensive suit sat. He hadn't moved. He was staring at his bowl of soup, but she could feel him watching. There was something different about him. He didn't look scared, and he didn't look angry. He looked like he was waiting. Ugochi took a deep breath and tried to remember the anatomy notes she had memorized earlier that day. She tried to tell herself that Rico and Tank were just obstacles on her path to something better. But as Rico reached out to grab her wrist, the biology notes vanished from her mind, replaced by a cold, sharp terror. She was thousands of miles from home, and for the first time, she felt like the distance was too great to bridge. The air in the diner felt like it was about to snap. Rico's hand shot out like a snake, his fingers clamping down on Ugochi's wrist. She let out a small gasp, and the tray she was holding tilted sharply. The clean glasses slid across the metal surface before crashing onto the floor. The sound of shattering glass filled the room, ringing out like a gunshot in the quiet diner. Rico didn't let go. Instead, he laughed, a mean and hollow sound. "Look at that mess," he sneered, pulling her closer until she stumbled. "I think you owe us an apology for the noise, sweetheart." From his dark booth, Kang Min-Lee watched the scene, but he wasn't just seeing Ugochi anymore. The sound of the breaking glass acted like a key, unlocking a door in his mind that he had kept tightly shut for 30 years. Suddenly, the neon lights of the diner faded, replaced by the flickering fluorescent bulbs of a small, dusty grocery store in the 1990s. In his memory, Min-Lee was only 10 years old. He was standing by a stack of canned goods, clutching his mother's coat. His mother, a woman who always smelled of ginger and laundry soap, was trying to pay for their food. She was struggling to count the unfamiliar coins, her face red with embarrassment as she whispered in broken English. Behind her, a group of tall men in leather jackets were losing their patience. One of the men had stepped forward, mocking her accent and calling her names that little Min-Lee didn't fully understand, but knew were bad. The man had reached out and swiped his hand across the counter, knocking their small bag of rice and fruit onto the dirty floor. The bag had split open, and the white grains of rice scattered everywhere, looking like tiny teeth against the linoleum. Min-Lee remembered the way his mother had looked in that moment. She hadn't fought back. She had just looked down, her shoulders shaking, and started to pick up the fruit with trembling hands. Young Min-Lee had felt a heat in his chest that day, a mixture of deep shame and a burning wish for power. He had promised himself that he would never be the person on the floor again. He had built his entire life, his whole empire of shadows, so that no one could ever knock anything out of his hand. Now, 30 years later, he was seeing the same scene play out in front of him. Ugochi was standing exactly where his mother had stood. Rico was wearing the same cruel smile as the man from the grocery store. The shattered glass on the floor was the same as the scattered rice. Min-Lee looked at his own hands. They were steady. They were powerful. He looked at Ugochi, who was trying to pull her arm away from Rico's grip. She looked so small. But her eyes weren't just full of fear. They were full of the same quiet strength his mother had used to survive those hard years. The heat he had felt as a 10-year-old boy returned, but it wasn't a wild fire anymore. It was a cold, sharp blade. He realized that for all his money and all his soldiers, he was still that boy in the grocery store if he didn't act. The dragon didn't care about street thugs or small-time bullies, but he cared about the memory of a woman who had worked until her hands bled to give him a future. Rico leaned in, his face inches from Ugochi's. "Maybe you should get on your knees and pick that up," he whispered. Min-Lee stood up. He didn't make a sound, and he didn't rush. He simply stepped out of the shadows of his booth. The movement was so smooth and calm that for a second, no one noticed. But as he walked toward the center of the room, the temperature seemed to drop. The ghost of the little boy was gone, replaced by a man who was done watching. The sound of Rico's laughter was like grease on a hot stove, thick, nasty, and spitting everywhere. He didn't just have Ugochi by the wrist anymore. He began to twist it, forcing her to lean over the jagged shards of glass on the floor. Ugochi's face was tight with pain, her eyes squeezed shut as she tried not to cry out. She knew that in this part of town, making a scene often made things worse. "I said get down there," Rico hissed. He reached out his other hand and began to pull at the white apron tied around her waist. It was a small move, but it was the move that changed everything. It wasn't just bullying anymore. It was an attempt to take away the last bit of dignity she had left in front of a room full of people. From behind the counter, Mr. Han couldn't watch any longer. His hands were shaking, but he found the courage that only comes from loving someone like a daughter. He grabbed a heavy wooden rolling pin and stepped out from the safety of the kitchen. "That is enough," Mr. Han shouted. His voice was thin and cracked, but it was loud. "Leave her alone and get out of my restaurant. You are not welcome here." Rico didn't even look scared. He didn't even look surprised. He just looked annoyed. He signaled to Marcus Tank Doyle without letting go of Ugochi. Tank stood up slowly, his massive shadow falling across the counter like a dark curtain. With one hand, Tank reached out and shoved Mr. Han in the chest. The old man was no match for the giant. Mr. Han flew backward, his heels catching on a rug as he tumbled into a stack of empty crates. The wooden boxes smashed against the floor, and Mr. Han stayed down, groaning and clutching his shoulder. "Mind your business, old man," Tank rumbled. "Or the next time, you won't get back up." Ugochi let out a sob, her eyes flying open to see Mr. Han on the floor. "Please," she begged Rico. "Stop. I will do whatever you want, just don't hurt him." Rico grinned, feeling like he was the king of the world. "That's better. Now, about that apology," he never finished the sentence. A sudden, heavy silence fell over the diner. It wasn't the kind of quiet that happens when people stop talking. It was the kind of cold, dead silence that happens right before a lightning strike. The air in the room seemed to freeze. It felt like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in a single second. Kang Min-Lee had stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't slide his chair back with a loud noise. He moved like a ghost rising from a grave. He stepped out from the shadows of his corner booth, his bespoke black suit looking like a shadow given shape. His face was a mask of perfect, terrifying calm. His eyes were not angry. They were empty, which was much, much worse. Tank turned around, his brow furrowing as he looked at the man in the suit. Rico froze, too, his hand still tight on Ugochi's wrist. They had spent their lives scaring people, and they knew what fear looked like. But they had never seen a man look at them the way Min-Lee was looking at them now. He wasn't looking at them like they were men. He was looking at them like they were dirt on the bottom of his shoe. Min-Lee took one step forward, then another. The tap of his expensive leather shoes on the tile floor sounded like a drum in the silence. Every person in the room held their breath. Ugochi looked at him, her eyes wide with wonder and terror. She realized that the man from the corner wasn't just a customer anymore. The dragon had finally left his cave, and the room went deathly cold because everyone knew that someone was about to pay for the disorder they had brought into his sanctuary. The time for watching was over. The sound of Min-Lee's footsteps was the only thing anyone could hear. He stopped exactly 6 feet away from Rico, his posture as straight and sharp as a razor blade. He didn't look at the broken glass. He didn't look at the giant standing behind him. He looked directly into Rico's eyes with a stare that felt like a weight pressing down on the room. "Sit down," Min-Lee said. His voice was not loud. It was not a scream or a growl. It was a calm, low command that carried the power of a man who was used to being obeyed by thousands. It was the kind of voice that made people stop what they were doing without even knowing why. For a second, Rico's hand loosened on Ugochi's wrist. He felt a shiver run down his spine, a primal warning that he was in the presence of a real predator. But then, he looked at his friends. He looked at the massive size of Tank. He looked at the expensive suit Min-Lee was wearing, and he felt a surge of foolish bravery. He didn't know he was looking at the most dangerous man in the tri-state area. He just saw a man who looked like he had too much money and not enough sense. Rico threw his head back and laughed. It was a forced, ugly sound. "Did you hear that, Tank? The businessman wants me to sit down. Maybe he wants to give me a job." Tank stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching on the glass shards. He towered over Min-Lee, looking like a mountain of muscle next to the slim man in the suit. "You got a lot of nerve, pal," Tank rumbled, his voice shaking the salt shakers on the nearby tables. "You should have stayed in your corner and finished your tea. Now you're going to get hurt." Ugochi looked between them, her face pale with terror. "Please," she whispered to Min-Lee. "Just go. They are too big. You don't have to do this." Min-Lee didn't blink. He didn't even turn his head toward her. His focus remained entirely on the men in front of him. He knew that bullies like Rico and Tank only understood two things: fear and force. They thought their muscles and their loud voices made them powerful. They had no idea that real power was the ability to take a life with a single movement, and the wisdom to know exactly when to do it. "I will not say it again," Min-Lee said, his voice even colder than before. "Sit down." Rico's face turned red with anger. He let go of Ugochi's arm and stepped toward Min-Lee, pointing a finger right at his chest. "You think you're special because you wear a fancy watch? You're nothing. In fact, I think I'll take that watch after we're done breaking your face." Tank reached out a massive hand, intending to grab Min-Lee by the shoulder and toss him across the room like he had done to Mr. Han. The third man at the door started to chuckle, waiting to see the rich guy get crumpled. They thought this was going to be another easy win. They thought they were the hunters, and he was the prey. They didn't see the way Min-Lee's weight shifted onto the balls of his feet. They didn't see the way his fingers curled into a specific, deadly shape. They didn't know that the dragon didn't bark, he only bit. And when he bit, he never let go. Tank's massive hand moved through the air like a falling tree. He was confident. His face twisted into a mean grin, expecting to crush the smaller man in the suit. But Kang Min-Lee did not flinch. He did not even step back. To the untrained eye, it looked like Min-Lee was standing still, but in reality, he was moving with the precision of a clock. Just as Tank's fingers were about to close around his throat, Min-Lee moved. It was a blur of black fabric and focused power. He stepped inside the giant's reach, pivoting his body with perfect balance. With his left hand, he caught Tank's wrist, and with his right, he struck a very specific spot on the giant's elbow. There was a sickening pop that echoed through the silent diner. Tank's eyes went wide. The grin vanished, replaced by a look of pure shock. Before the giant could even scream, Min-Lee used Tank's own weight against him. He twisted the arm in a way that bones were never meant to go, and with a short, sharp shove, he sent the 300-pound man flying backward. Tank hit the floor with a heavy thud that made the plates on the counter rattle. He didn't get back up. He lay there, gasping for air, his face turning a ghostly shade of white as he clutched his ruined arm. It had happened so fast, less than 3 seconds, that Rico was still standing with his finger pointed in the air, his mouth hanging open in a silent O. The third man at the door stopped laughing. He took one look at his giant friend on the floor, and then at Min-Lee, who hadn't even messed up his hair. The dragon simply straightened his cuffs, his expression never changing. He wasn't breathing hard, and his eyes were still as calm as a deep pond. Ugochi let out a small breath she didn't know she was holding. She had seen men fight before, but this wasn't a fight. It was a surgical strike. It was the work of a man who had spent his entire life learning exactly how to break a human body with the least amount of effort. It was a terrifying display of elite training that showed everyone in the room that Min-Lee was not just a businessman. He was a weapon. Rico's hand began to shake. He looked at Tank, then back at Min-Lee. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. The predators were now the prey, and for the first time in his life, Rico realized he had walked into a trap he couldn't talk his way out of. Min-Lee took a slow step toward him, and Rico actually stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. "You wanted to see my watch?" Min-Lee asked quietly. His voice was like a cold wind through a graveyard. "Come and take it." Rico shook his head frantically, his face pale with sweat. He looked at the door, but the man standing there was already reaching for the handle, ready to run and leave his boss behind. The diner was no longer a place they could bully people. It had become a court, and the judge had just delivered his first sentence. Rico was trembling so hard that his teeth made a clicking sound in the quiet room. He looked at Tank, who was still groaning on the floor, and then at the man in the black suit. Min-Lee didn't look like he had just broken a giant's arm. He looked like he was deciding what to do with a piece of trash he had found on his shoe. The man at the door tried to slip away, but Min-Lee didn't even look at him. He simply reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, heavy gold ring. He set it down on the table with a sharp clack. On the face of the ring was the image of a coiled dragon. Rico's eyes went wide. He knew that symbol. Everyone in the city's shadow world knew it. It belonged to the Kang Syndicate. This wasn't just a rich businessman. This was the dragon himself. You are Kang Min-Lee," Rico whispered, his voice cracking. He suddenly fell to his knees, his hands held up as if to block a blow. "Please. I didn't know. We didn't know this was your place. We'll leave. We'll never come back." Min-Lee looked down at him. "You are right. You will never come back. But you are not leaving yet." The third man at the door froze with his hand on the handle. He turned back, his face white with fear, and slowly walked over to join Rico on the floor. Even Tank tried to sit up, despite the pain, because he knew that being disrespectful to a man like Min-Lee was a death sentence. "You have brought disorder to a place of peace," Min-Lee said. His voice was cold and steady. "You have frightened a woman who works harder in one day than you have in your entire lives. You have laid hands on a man who is a better father than you will ever be." Rico started to sob. "We'll do anything. Just don't kill us." Min-Lee leaned in closer. "Killing you would be too easy. It would not fix the mess you made." He pointed to the shattered glass and the spilled drinks on the floor. "There is a mop in the back. There are buckets. You three are going to clean this diner until the floor shines like a mirror." Rico blinked, confused. "Clean?" "Yes," Min-Lee continued. "And that is only the beginning. You will come here every single night for the next month. You will wear aprons. You will wash the dishes. You will scrub the toilets. And you will take out the trash. And most importantly," Min-Lee's eyes turned into ice, "you will pay for every single meal every customer eats in this diner for the next 30 days. If 1 cent is missing, or if you are 1 minute late, I will find you." Ugochi stood by the kitchen door, her jaw dropping. She had expected a fight, or perhaps something much worse. But this was a different kind of justice. She watched as Rico and the third man scrambled to find the cleaning supplies. Even Tank, using his one good arm, began to crawl toward a fallen chair to set it upright. Mr. Han had managed to stand up with Ugochi's help. He watched his old friend Min-Lee with a mixture of pride and sadness. He knew that Min-Lee was still the boy who hated bullies, even if he had become a man of shadows to stop them. Min-Lee turned to Mr. Han and Ugochi. The terrifying dragon mask didn't disappear, but it softened just a tiny bit. "I apologize for the mess," he said. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a stack of $100 bills, laying them on the counter. "This is for the broken glass. And for the extra work." "Michael, you don't have to," Mr. Han started to say. "I do," Min-Lee interrupted gently. He looked at Ugochi, who was staring at the thugs as they began to scrub the floor with desperate speed. "No one will ever knock a tray out of your hand again. You have my word." He picked up his dragon ring and slipped it back onto his finger. Without another word, he walked back to his booth and sat down. His soup was cold now, but he didn't care. He watched as the men who had acted like kings just minutes ago worked on their hands and knees, terrified of the man who was calmly finishing his tea. The sentence had been passed, and in the Lucky Crane diner, the dragon's word was the only law that mattered. The diner remained quiet, except for the wet sound of mops hitting the floor and the heavy breathing of Rico and his crew as they worked. Kang Min-Lee watched them for a moment, ensuring they were scrubbing with the focus they had lacked earlier. Satisfied, he turned his attention back to the counter. Ugochi was still standing near Mr. Han, her eyes moving between the thugs on the floor and the man who had saved them. Min-Lee reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. He didn't say a word as he placed it on the counter next to the cash register. Ugochi looked at the envelope, then at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "That is for your books," Min-Lee said simply. "A doctor needs many books, and they should not have to worry about the cost of them while they are trying to learn how to save lives." Ugochi's hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. When she peeked inside, her breath caught in her throat. It was not just a tip. It was enough money to cover her tuition for the rest of medical school, and then some. It was a life-changing amount of money, the kind that meant she would no longer have to work double shifts until her feet bled. "I cannot take this, sir," Ugochi whispered, her eyes filling with tears of shock. "It is too much." "It is not a gift," Min-Lee replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "It is an investment. The city needs more people who want to help others. Consider it a tax I am paying to ensure a better future." He looked at her books again. "Study hard. That is the only way you can repay it." Before she could argue further, Min-Lee pulled out his phone. He dialed a number that was not in his contacts, but one he knew by heart. When a voice answered on the other end, Min-Lee's tone shifted into something sharp and cold, like a winter frost. "This is Kang," he said. The person on the other end clearly knew exactly who was calling, as the silence that followed was immediate. "I am at the Lucky Crane Diner on 4th Street. Listen carefully. This building and everyone inside it are now under my personal protection. If a single window is broken, if a single person is harassed, or if a police siren gets too loud near this door without my permission, I will hold your precinct responsible." He paused, listening to the hurried promises coming through the speaker. "Good. Tell your officers to keep their eyes open and their mouths shut when they pass this corner. This is my sanctuary. Do not let it be disturbed again." He ended the call and tucked the phone away. Mr. Han looked at him with wet eyes. He knew that with those few words, Min-Lee had placed an invisible shield around the diner. No local gang would dare to walk in with trouble, and the police would suddenly become very helpful neighbors. The Lucky Crane was no longer just a small restaurant, it was a fortress. Min-Lee stood up and straightened his jacket one last time. He looked at Rico, who was currently scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain near the door. Rico looked up, terrified, and began to mop even faster. "I will be back next Sunday," Min-Lee said, looking at Mr. Han. "I expect the floor to be clean." "It will be, Michael," Mr. Han said, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "It will be." Ugochi watched him walk toward the door. She felt as if she were watching a legend step back into the shadows. She realized that while he was a man who lived in a world of violence, he had used that darkness to create a circle of light for her. As the doorbell jingled softly behind him, she gripped the envelope tight, feeling the weight of her family's future and her own dreams finally becoming real. The cool night air hit Kang Min-Lee's face as he stepped out onto the sidewalk. Behind him, the bell on the diner door gave one last, quiet jingle. He stood there for a moment, adjusting his tie and looking down the long, dark street. The city was still loud and busy, but in this one small corner, everything felt different. Min-Lee walked toward his black car, which was waiting at the curb. His driver opened the door, but Min-Lee didn't get in right away. He looked back at the glowing window of the Lucky Crane Diner. Inside, he could see the shapes of Rico and his friends still bent over their mops. He saw Ugochi talking quietly with Mr. Han, her shoulders no longer tight with fear. For many years, Min-Lee thought that power was about how many people feared him. He thought it was about the size of his bank account and the strength of his grip on the city's throat. He had spent a long time being a dragon that people ran away from. But tonight, he realized that he had been wrong. He thought about the envelope he left for Ugochi. He thought about the phone call he made to the police. These were small things for a man with his resources, but to Ugochi and Mr. Han, they were everything. He realized that people like Ugochi, The hard workers, the students, the invisible people who kept the city running, were the ones who truly mattered. They were the ones who deserved to feel safe. A memory of his mother flashed through his mind again. He imagined her in a world where someone like him had been there to watch over that grocery store. He realized that he couldn't change his own past, but he could change the future for others. This was his new legacy. He wouldn't just be a boss who ruled through shadows. He would be a shield for those who had no one else to protect them. The weight on his chest, the heavy guilt he had carried since he was 10 years old, finally felt a little lighter. He understood now that his power wasn't a curse or a weapon to be used for greed. It was a tool. Protecting the innocent was the only thing that made being a dragon worth it. "Is everything okay, boss?" his driver asked softly. Min-Lee looked at the ring on his finger, the gold dragon catching the light of a street lamp. "Yes," he said, and for the first time in a very long time, he meant it. Everything is exactly how it should be. He sat back in the soft leather seat as the car pulled away from the curb. He watched the Lucky Crane diner fade into the distance until it was just a small, bright light in the dark city. He was going back to his world of business and secrets. But he was leaving a part of his heart behind in that diner. Kang Min-Lee was still a man of the Mafia, but tonight he had finally found his way back to being human. The dragon was still awake, but now he was standing guard.